Welcome once again. This is Pinnacle Professional College, and today we'll be beginning a lecture on competition. I touched on it in our previous lecture a little bit, but today we'll be going into more and more detail. So if you haven't subscribed to this channel, please do so. Hit the notification bell so that if you consistently want to receive lectures like this, you would be notified of it. So let's move straight into it. Competition analysis. Competition analysis is basically assessing the strengths and weaknesses of your competitors in a market, right? You are trying to assess the strengths and weaknesses of your competitors in the market, right? So that's what we mean by competition analysis. A company should also monitor each of its major competitors, because in order to obtain a competitive advantage, it is essential to know about what competitors are doing. Michael Porter, the one who designed the Porter's diamond, also designed the Porter's 5 forces model, which basically provides a framework for analyzing the strength of competition in the market. Right? So it basically analyzes the strength or the depths of competition in the market. What you need to note is that it is not a model for analyzing individual competitors, right? Or even what differentiates the performance of different firms in the market, right? The Porter's 5 forces model does not assess why one company performs better than another. That's not what it is looking at. It's looking at things from a market perspective. What is the intensity of the strength of competition in that market? So we are not looking at individuals, we are looking at the market in its entirety. And that's what Porter's 5 forces model does. It looks at the market in its entirety and not a tool for analyzing individual competitors or to say that this competitor is better than the other. Now let's look at profitability and competition. The 5 forces model can be used to explain why some industries are more profitable than others. So that companies operating in one industry are able to make bigger profits than companies operating in another industry. Now, again, note here that the keyword here uses industry, not individual companies, the entire industry, the entire market. That's what you're focusing on. Profitability is affected by the strength of competition. It's affected by the strength of competition. The stronger the competition, the lower the profits. This is certainly very reasonable. Porter argued that there are 2 factors that affect profitability. You might know one because we kind of discussed this. Number 1 is the competition in the industry, right? How the industry is structured and the competition in the industry, that affects profitability. Number 2 is competitive advantage. If a company has competitive advantage over other companies, that would affect profitability. So 2 factors, competition and competitive advantage. You can call them the 2 C's. Now let's move on to the 5 forces. Michael Porter identified 5 forces or forces that determine the strength and the nature of competition in the market. Take note of the 2 words, the strength and the nature of competition in the market or in the industry. We said that the Porter's 5 forces model looks at competition from a very industry, from an industry perspective or from a market perspective, not an individual company perspective. So these are, number 1, threats from potential entries. Number 2, threats from substitute products. Number 3, the bargaining power of suppliers. Number 4, the bargaining power of customers. Number 5, competitive rivalry. So these are the 5 forces. Please keep them in mind. Very, very important. Very, very important. I recommend that you can form an acronym as you please in order to remember it. Now, when competition in an industry or market is very strong, firms must supply their products or services at a competitive price. When there's strong competition, you cannot just charge any price and make supernormal profits, right? Because there are a lot of people competing for the same, people. A lot of companies competing for the same market for the same people, right? So in a very competitive market, you must make sure that you don't charge an excessive price, and you should know that you might not be able to make supernormal profits. You might not be able to make supernormal profits. When any of the 5 forces are strong, competition in the market is likely to be strong, and profitability will therefore be low. So let's look at number 1, threats from potential entrants. Right? So put on your market industry lens. Look at it from a market perspective or industry perspective, right? What are some of the things that will increase competition? One factor is threat from potential entries. So what we mean here is that as companies operate in a particular industry, you'd see them making profits, and then other new companies might be interested in taking some of these profits, and so would like to come into that industry. So what's the threat of potential entrants, right? If the threat is very, very high, that has an implication on competition. The threat is very, very low, it also has an implication on the competition. One of the 5 forces is the threat that new competitors will enter the market and add to competition, right? So if new competitors come into the market, competition will increase. However, if there are strong boundaries in that industry and it's not easy for competitors to come into the market, then competition will likely reduce. New entrants might be attracted by the high profits earned by existing competitors into the market or by the potential for making high profits. When they enter the market, new entrants will try to establish a share of the market that is large enough, right? So the significance of this threat is basically dependent on how easy or hard it is for new competitors to enter the market. If there are some costs to entering the market, there are some barriers to entering the market, then it will be difficult for new competitors to enter the market, and therefore competition will decrease. But if it's just easy to enter the market, then competition will increase. Competition will increase, and that's the situation with the space-to-space business. I got to a point where everyone was doing it. The costs or mobile money business. The costs and practical difficulties of entering a market are called barriers to entry. Right, barriers to entry. So there are sometimes costs to entering a market. So for example, if you want to enter into the telecommunications industry, there's a cost, because the telecommunication industry can be very, very capital intensive. So you have to set up plants, masts, all kinds of capital intensive things must go into place, fiber, all kinds of things must go into place before you can set up a successful telecommunication company. And so these are costs, right? So these costs are essentially called barriers to entry. So if new entrants are able to come into the market without much difficulty, firms already in the market are likely to keep prices low and to meet customer needs as effectively as possible. So when barriers to entry are low, new competitors can come in, create competition, and therefore pricing would be low. As a result, competition in the market will be strong, right? And there will be no opportunities for high profit margins when the barriers are low. Very, very important. When the barriers are very, very high, there are also implications. It will be difficult to enter the market. and therefore existing competitors can charge higher prices, and can charge high prices and make high profits. A number of factors might help to create high barriers to entry. Number one is economies of scale. When there are economies of scale, that could be a barrier to entry. Economies of scale is basically reduction in costs as a result of large volumes of output. So this is a situation where a company's average cost per unit declines as a result of volume by selling and producing items in large quantities. Economies of scale are reduction in average costs that are achieved by producing and selling an item in larger quantities. In an industry where economies of scale are large and the biggest firms can achieve substantially low costs than smaller producers, it is much more difficult for a new firm to enter the market, right? So if the economies of scale and bigger companies are already enjoying this because of the ability to produce on a large scale, right? You cannot compete as a small company with such a large company that are gaining cost advantages, right? If you are gaining cost advantages, you're able to price better. And sometimes you can end up outpricing smaller companies, right? And when the company is not big enough, it's very small, it will not be able to achieve economies of scale because they are producing on a very small scale. And so its cost will be higher. And then in that sense, they will not be competitive in the market. Another high barrier to entry is capital investments. As I gave the example of the telecommunications industry, we realize that capital investment is also a thing, right? If a new company has to make large investments into assets, then that will act as a barrier to entry, Very, very important. So there's a reason why there are few telecommunications companies, because the investment is high. There's a reason why there's a few space travel companies, because the cost is very, very high. Access to distribution channel. In some markets, there are only a limited number of distribution outlets or distribution channels. If a new entry will have difficulty in gaining access to any of these distribution channels, the barrier to entry is high. So, in some industries, it's not easy for a small company or a new entrant to gain access to distribution channels. There are some products by some larger companies that have already taken over the distribution channels. And so if as a smaller company you are coming in and you don't have access to these channels, it becomes much difficult to compete. Another point also which serves as a barrier is the time to become established, right? There are some industries where customers attach a lot of importance to brand, right? To brand. So they'll rather buy something that they know is a brand rather than buy another thing that is not really tested or is not a brand. So the fashion industry is an example, right? It will take a longer time for a smaller company to establish a brand and become accepted in the market. So in that sense, the cost to entry is very, very high. Know-how is another point, right? Know-how can also be a barrier. So if it is very time-consuming and expensive for a new entrant to acquire, then that becomes a barrier as well. We also have switching costs. What are switching costs? Switching costs are the costs that a buyer has to incur in switching from one supplier to another supplier, right? So in some industries, these switching costs are high. It's not easy to move from one supplier to the other, right? So just to bounce off some supplier to supplier, it's not that easy, right? So in the audit world, sometimes it might be difficult to switch from one audit firm to another, right? And if these switching costs are very, very high, then it becomes a barrier, right? And then it becomes difficult for new entrants to break into the market, right? If the switching costs are very, very high. So the last point, I think, which I'll use to end these barriers is government regulation. So regulations can also be a barrier to new entrants in the market. So for example, if the government puts in place, a policy that says for you to operate in the, let's say, gold industry, you need to have a license, and the license costs this much, right? In that sense, it will not be easy for a small company to get into something like that, to get into that industry. So number one, we've talked about threats from potential entrants. Now let's talk about threats from substitute products. There's a threat from substitute products when customers can switch fairly easily to buy alternative products, right? So when it's easy for a customer to switch to an alternate product, that's a threat. And it can vary between markets and industry. So these are a few examples. Number one, you have domestic heating systems, right? Customers or consumers might want to switch from gas-fired to electricity-fired heating systems. In the transport industry, this could also happen. Customers might want to switch between air transport to, let's say, switch from road transport to, let's say, air transport. So these are all examples. So when there are substitute products that customers might buy, firms must make their products more attractive than the alternatives, right? So if it's easy to switch from one product to an alternative, what do you think the impact would be? If it's easy to do that, then competition would increase. If it's hard to do that, the competition falls. Competition within a market or industry will therefore be higher when the threat from substitute product is high, right? So if the threat coming from alternative product is high, that is, it's easy to switch from your current product to an alternative product, then essentially what it means is that that competition would increase. Threats from substitute products may vary over time. There are many examples in the past of industries that may have been significantly affected by the emergence of new substitute products. Now, plastic containers and bottles became a significant substitute for glass, right? So in the past, it was glass bottles. Glass bottles were the thing. In the past, it was glass bottles. And then it switched to plastic containers. All right, so if that switch is easy, then competition increases. If that switch is very, very hard, then competition decreases. In other words, if the threat from substitute product is high, competition will therefore be higher. Let's move on to bargaining power of suppliers. Bargaining power of suppliers. In some industries, suppliers have considerable power. Right? Suppliers have considerable power. When this occurs, they might charge high prices that firms buying from them are unable to pass on to their own customers. Right? So if suppliers have a lot of power, what do you think they will do? They'll charge high prices. They'll charge high prices. Porter routes. Suppliers can exert, this is what Michael Porter said. Suppliers can exert bargaining power over participants in an industry by threatening to raise prices or reduce the quality of purchased goods or services. Powerful suppliers can thereby squeeze profitability out of an industry, unable to recover cost increases in its own prices. So you see, if a supplier has power, they can just increase their prices. Very, very important. Then you also have bargaining power of customers. Buyers can also reduce the profitability of an industry when they have considerable buying power. Right. So if customers have a lot of power, what will happen? They have a lot of power. It means that they can drive prices low. So they're able to demand lower prices. They're able to demand more and more product sophistication, right? So they would want, if they want certain specifications of a product, they're able to demand for it. Strong buyers also make rival firms compete to supply them with their products. So in many countries, a notable example of buyer power is the power of supermarkets as buyers in the markets for many consumer goods. They are able to force down the prices, see? So if they're able to force down prices, then profits in that industry will be low. It's very, very important. So Michael Porter suggested that buyers might be particularly powerful in the following situations. In which areas do we see the power of the customer or the buyer? So they are very, very powerful in the sense that the volume of their purchase is high relative to the size of the supplier. The volume of the purchases is high relative to the size of the supplier, then the buyer is powerful. When the products of rival suppliers are undifferentiated, when the products of rival suppliers are undifferentiated, when the products of suppliers are undifferentiated, buyers have power. Why? Because they can move from one product or one supplier to the other. When the cost of switching from one supplier to another are low, right? If the cost of switching is low or is easy, buyers have power as well. When the cost of a purchase item is a significant proportion of the buyer's total cost. When the cost of the purchased item is a significant proportion of the buyer's total cost. Now, this is self-explanatory. So if the customers, the item that they buy, in proportion to the buyer's total cost is high, then they have power. When the profits of the buyer are low, when the buyer's products, when the profits of the company are low, that's the other point. When the buyer's product is not affected significantly by the quality of the good that it buys. When the company's product is not affected significantly by the quality of the goods that it buys, right? So all these things give the customer power. So if the buyer's product is not affected by the quality of the goods that it buys, it gives the customer power. Because if it's, an easy to make product, then another competitor can make it and sell it. When the buyer also has full information, about suppliers and prices, it gives them power. As they say, information is power. So these are all situations where the customer would have bargaining power. So when you're asked in the exam, you should remember the volume of the purchases. You should remember undifferentiated products. You should remember the cost of switching. You should remember information. Now let's move on to competitive rivalry. Competition within an industry is obviously also determined by the rivalry within or between the competitors. Strong competition forces rival firms to offer their products to customers at a very low price. It's very, very key. Very, very key. So when there's strong competition, customers would offer their product at a very low price. Porter suggested that competitor rivalry might be strong in any of the following instances. Number one is when the rival firms are just about the same size and economic strength. If you have good enough companies with the strength, with the size in an industry, it encourages competitive rivalry. In an industry where there's a company that is huge in size and the other ones are small, that's not proper rivalry, because the big, extremely big company can, kick out the small companies from the industry. But where there are rival firms of roughly the same size and economic strength, competition is there. Number two, when there are many competitors as well, competition is high. When there's only slow growth in sales demand market, competition is high. When the products of the rival firms are largely the same, we talked about this earlier. When they are undifferentiated products, it's also the same situation. When fixed costs in the industry are high, so that firms still make some contribution to profits even when they cut prices, right? So that's also another point. Competitor rivalry might be strong when fixed costs in the industry are high, right? What does this mean? Fixed cost is cost that you cannot negotiate on, right? So fixed cost is different from variable cost. Variable cost changes with output. Fixed cost is fixed. And so when fixed costs are high in the industry, competition is fierce because companies must be able to at least cover their fixed costs. Yeah. Very, very important. When supply capacity can only be increased in large incremental amounts, right? That also gives rise to high competition. Another important point is when the cost of leaving the industry is very high, right? Then it increases competition, right? There are some industries where the cost of living is very high, or cost of withdrawing yourself from that industry is very, very high, especially in capital-intensive industries like telecom. Sometimes to leave the industry, it comes at huge costs, right? Because you have all kinds of capital-intensive investments that have been made. Very, very important. So let's look at the 5 forces model and let's see how it's all been summarized. The 5 forces model has all been summarized. Very, very important. Now you have threat from potential entrants, and direct you see time and cost of entry, how long it takes to enter the market and the cost at which you enter. If the time to take is very long, competition reduces. If the cost is high, competition reduces because people will not be likely to enter the industry. Building a brand is another point. Specialist knowledge required, right? We explained all these points. If specialist knowledge is required, then what it means is that new entrants must learn this knowledge before being able to go into the industry to succeed, right? If this knowledge is very, very technical and it's not easy for new entrants to learn it, then what happens is, competition reduces because they cannot enter into the market. When they are able to enter into the market, they add to competition. Another point is economies of scale, right? And then the last point will be technology protection for existing firms. Now, let's move on to suppliers' bargaining power. We've talked about all these things, but I'm trying to bring everything together. What affects suppliers' bargaining power? You have the number of suppliers, you have the size of the suppliers, you have the uniqueness of the service, you have the ability to buy substitute products, right? You have the cost of switching, you have the importance of the product. Now, let me take the first one, for instance. If the number of suppliers are high, right, then it means that they have a lot of power. They have a lot of power. If the size of the suppliers is large, in that sense, they have a lot of power. If you have a lot of power, you can influence prices. So think about it that way, right? When you think about these things, think about the factor, how it impacts competition, and then how it impacts profits. Then you have competitive rivalry. Here too, you have the number of competitors, you have the size of competitors, you have the quality, cost of switching, customer loyalty, etc. You have bargaining power as well, which is kind of like the opposite of supplier bargaining power. You have customer bargaining power, you have supplier bargaining power. So customer bargaining power, here we are looking at the number of customers, the size of the order, the cost of switching, the pricing, etc. Then to our last point is threats from substitutes. Threats from substitutes. We are looking at threats from alternative products here. So the existence of these alternative products, how they perform, how easy it is to switch from one substitute product to another. You are looking at the relative prices, etc. So in your examination, you might be required to use what we call the 5 forces model. And basically here you are supposed to analyze the strength of the competition, which is very, very crucial. You're supposed to be able to analyze the strength of the competition, the strength of the competition in the market or the industry, right? To do this, you have to take each of the 5 forces, right? So the 5 forces we mentioned earlier, these ones, you have to take each of them and be able to explain it. So for example, if you pick threats from potential entrants, so if the threat from potential entrants is high, right, then it means that they can easily enter into the market and add to competition, right? If the threat from potential entrants is low, it means that they cannot enter into the market and therefore competition reduces. So what are the factors that drive this? And this is what we explained earlier, right? So please take time to understand these concepts. They are very, very important. You need to understand how all of these things work, right? All of these things work. So let's take an example. I'll use an example to explain this. Let's look at the example 5 forces, CDs and DVDs, right? The 5 forces model can be used to analyze the competition for Amazon. And Amazon is a company that supplies all kinds of things, books, DVDs, all kinds of things. You can find it's there, right? So you are looking at competition in that sense. So threats from potential entrants. If you look at a company like Amazon, right, and you look at the industry in which it operates, what do you think the threats from potential entrants would be? It would be low, right? Because Amazon is a brand, and they have a good distribution system, right? So it would be difficult for a potential entrant to succeed competing against Amazon. Then you have suppliers bargaining power. Amazon obtains its products from a large number of different suppliers, right? The bargaining power of most suppliers is therefore likely to be weak, with suppliers needing Amazon more than Amazon needing individual suppliers. So Amazon has grown big such that suppliers are trying to list their products on Amazon, right? And Amazon has the luxury of sourcing from different suppliers. So suppliers do not necessarily have high power when it comes to Amazon. They have customers bargaining power. Customers bargaining power. Amazon has a very large customer base, right? They have a very large customer base, but I don't think customers don't have too much power when it comes to when it comes to bargaining, right? I don't think customers have the ability to drive prices down, stuff like that. Even though customer feedback is important on Amazon, I'm not sure if they are able to drive prices down. It's possible they can drive prices down because Amazon is, a huge platform, right? There is competition. So if two people are selling the same product, they are trying to win the same customers, right? They are selling two similar products. They are trying to win the same customer. So one of the tools they might use is to price better. So then you have threats from substitutes. What is an alternative to Amazon? An alternative to Amazon would be your retail bookshop or even eBay and other online auction sites, right? Even though these are good alternatives, Amazon stands tall among all of this. So it's kind of difficult to compete with them. In terms of competitive rivalry, Amazon has a few competitors here and there, but Amazon at the moment seems very, very strong in the competitive landscape. Right. So in conclusion, this would be how you would look at it in terms of Amazon's competitive landscape. So that's an example, by the way. That's an example. Now we would be talking about the life cycle model. The life cycle model, right? We'll be talking about the classical product life cycle. I'm sure you've heard about this. We're talking about the cost implications of the product life cycle, the relevance of product life cycle to strategic management, and then the cycle of competition. The cycle of competition. I'll introduce this briefly, and then in our next lecture, we would talk about product life cycle in much more detail. So please take and stay with me. So the classical product life cycle, I'll just define it, and then you can read ahead before the next lecture. The life cycle is simply the period from the birth or the creation of the product to the end of its life, right? Just think about it like a human being. A human being is born, grows, gets old, and passes away. So the life cycle is the same in that regard. And for now, what you need to know is that there are 4 phases of that life cycle. There's the introduction phase, there's the growth phase, there is the maturity phase, and there's the decline phase, right? So these are all phases. So under the introduction phase, we would explain what it is in the coming lecture. The growth phase will explain the maturity phase and the decline phase and what causes these phases. And can companies reinvent themselves to be able to not decline, or can products reinvent themselves to be able to not decline? So these are very, very important points that we'll be looking into. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Please listen to the lectures very attentively. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments. Thank you very much for listening and have a good day. Bye-bye.